Hi there. Um, my name is Dylan Davis. I am the designer of this card game called Mythion Card Game, or Mythion, the card game. um, and while I have a tabletop simulator version up on the screen right now, um, there are a number of different ways you can play the Mythian card game. Number one being you can go to our website, mythiancardgame.squarespace.com, and you can download two free starter decks, which would be these two actually, the Gavin and the AI Nima starter decks, completely free. In addition, they will come with this World Tree deck, but we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So to start, there's a number of things that I want to talk about in order to help new players to learn to play a game of Mythian. So Mythian is a card game similar to Magic the Gathering, but more similar to another card game called Flesh and Blood. Um, Not only that, but it doesn't use the randomized pack system that Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, Flesh and Blood, Magic. It doesn't use that. It uses a more living card game system, like unto the games that Fantasy Flight Games makes. So Arkham Horror and Legend of the Five Rings and things like that. We're very indie, very budget. So, you know, we don't have the same back end to produce large amount of product. So in that way, we're also a lot like Null Signal Games, the creators of, and the I suppose the curators of Netrunner, the outfit that's keeping Netrunner alive. But anyway, so a game of Mythian will play out a lot like many of the card games you might have played before. And in order to start playing Mythian, the only thing you really need are two decks, the World Tree deck, some dice, and a way to play. Mythian can be played from 2 to 4 players, at least as of now. But 2 to 4, 2 is the ideal sweet spot. That's what the game is mostly designed for. But it could technically be played up to 4 players. And so to talk about the sort of the anatomy of a deck first, we have the identity card, we have the ascended identity, we have a number of cards that are proprietary for any given deck, right? So in this case, it would be these 3 cards. And we have a generic object of power. And we'll talk about the object of power soon. So Gavin, as you can see, not sure why, but the tabletop simulator version, the file looks pretty compressed to me. The image is a little muddy. It looks a lot better when you get the print and play PDFs and the and make playing cards version. But the goal of Mythian is to satisfy multiple win conditions, right? So on Gavin's hero card, it says ego, and ego is the first sort of easiest win condition that a player can achieve. And the ego states to manifest, for in this case Gavin, manifest the perfect design, which is to manifest all 5 design cards in the play area. Now, normally the play area is called the subliminal, but with the starter decks, I wanted to make sure that people understood, or no, it's not called the subliminal, excuse me. It's called the theater. But I wanted to make sure that the normal cards are, or at least this first round of cards would use more generic, readily accessible terminology. But going forward, you'll see often words like subliminal, theater, deprogram, discarnate, right? And these words are just our versions of the various well-known zones in any given card game, right? So perhaps a later printing of Gavin would say manifest all 5 design cards in the theater. And that just means shared play area. And then he also has an activated ability. So once per turn, you can spend 5 resources. Look at the top 4 cards, or if you do, you can look at the top 4 cards of your subliminal, which is your deck. You may manifest one design element from among them without paying its cost. Shuffle your subliminal. And then, finally, he has something that's very key, which is he has an encumbrance number, which is 5 negative ideations. So, 5 negative ideations will become very important soon, but I want to talk about some other things first. In addition to your identity card, we'll talk about this version of the identity in a minute. You also have these 2 cards, and these are very important. These are your objects of power. So objects of power are cards that start on the start in the play area at the beginning of the game, right? So you always have your leader or your identity, and you always have your 2 objects of power. And every hero, every identity, excuse me, flesh and blood, every identity can have up to 2 objects of power. There's not really a reason as of now to run less than 2. But in this case, we have Gavin's sketchbook. So Gavin Sims, object of power, right? So it's very clearly marked as to what this card is. Gavin Sims, object of power. Destroy this object. Doesn't cost anything. Search your subliminal for 1 design element and manifest it. Perfect. That means that you only need to find 3 from your own deck, right? Because you need to manifest 5. This searches 1, which technically is 4, but there's a specific mechanic about Gavin that makes it so that you can't find all 5 in his deck. But we'll talk about that, of course, in a moment. And then alchemy, and this is the generic object of power. And all the decks that come with the first set of Mythion will come with alchemy. They all have their personalized object of power and then the generic object of power. I think it also should be noted too that you cannot have you can't have 2 alchemy, for example, and you can't have 2 Gavin sketchbook. You can only have 1. And this would go for all objects of power. But anyway, so this is the generic object of power. 1 time, pay 0, draw 2 cards or intuit 2 cards. Now intuit is a unique mechanic in Mythion, which allows you to draw from the World Tree deck, and that's that shared deck I showed you earlier. This deck over here. At the end of your turn, if this was activated for its effect, place it in the discarnate zone. Now, of course, the discarnate zone is simply the graveyard, the discard area, the discard pile, anything that you would want to call it. That's where this goes. That's what the discarnate zone is. Intuiting means, like I just said, it means to draw a number of cards from the World Tree deck. And there was one thing I wanted to note here too. For 1 design element and manifest it. So manifest is our version of cast. Manifest is to play a card. By manifesting, you are taking a card from your hand or from a particular area and putting it into the theater. That's all that means. Okay, so with that out of the way, we can talk about a couple of key card types. So as of now, there's really only 3 card types. And we don't even have them all out right now, but that's okay. So the first one is an effect. So this is a generic effect. Tranquility reads, generic effect, deprogram 1 negative ideation. Now, this will make more sense as we go along, but deprogramming is essentially to remove these cards from your deck. So what is this? This is called anguish. Costs. We'll talk about the cost in a moment. It is a generic negative ideation. You and your opponent, so it has a clock symbol on it, right? You and your opponent have X turns to remove this card from the game, where X is the number after the clock. If you don't, you both lose. Uh-oh. So now we got to talk about this. Negative ideation cards are the key mechanic in Mythion. It is what I would say is the core gameplay element of a game of Mythion, is finding and deprogramming these cards. So how do you do that? Well, The key way that you do that is all built into the draw and play system of a game. Actually, there's one thing I wanted to do. Let's put this guy on the bottom. Excuse me. There we go. Perfect. Okay, put that guy on the bottom as well, just so that we can get an idea of how this works. All right, so let's return to the Gavin card. So the ego is worth 1 point, 1 victory point. So when you satisfy this requirement, manifest the perfect design. So you've summoned all, or you've manifested all 5 of the design element cards. You can consider the ego complete, and you have achieved, the player who has done this, meaning if you're playing as Gavin, you have achieved 1 victory point. And then I guess that means we can also talk about this now. No, we'll talk about that in a moment. So, that's good, right? Achieving 1 victory point is good. However, what is standing in your way oftentimes, I'll put these in our hand, is these negative ideations. And these negative ideations are what are essentially the encumbrance of a particular character, right? So in this case, Gavin has 5. He has 5 negative ideations. And with 5 negative ideations, that means that he needs to effectively find 5 of these cards in his deck, in his subliminal, and deprogram them. And the way you deprogram them can be found in the upper right-hand corner. So we have the I symbol with a 7, and we have the clock symbol with a 3. So the I symbol is how much it costs, and the clock symbol is how many turns you have to deprogram it, meaning to pay 7 resources. Now, you and your opponent can pay these resources. In fact, most of the time you have to. And the reason being is if any one of these negative ideations reach 0, you both lose the game. The game ends. So it's incredibly important for both you and your opponent to be working together to make sure that these don't ever detonate, I suppose. It's almost like there's a bunch of negative emotions that are pouring out of each player character, and these emotional bombs, and they all need to be diffused, right? So there are 8 in every deck, but every leader, every identity has a varying number, right? So in the case of Gavin, it's 5. I believe in the case of AI Neiman, it's also 5. Yes. In the case of AI Neiman, it is also 5. In the case of York, a character who is not part of the starter deck, but is part of the set 1 that you'll be able to buy from Make Playing Cards, his is 7. So he has a very high. You need to deprogram 7 of the 8. And Detective Masha Carton is 6. So she has slightly higher as well. Not as high as York. York has the highest. But York's also my favorite character to play. Anyway, so that's how this works. And you're probably asking now, okay, what happens after I deprogram 5 negative ideations? Well, you count this as essentially your hero, your identity, ascending to kind of a new plane of existence, a higher plane of reality, right? And so Gavin becomes Galzu, Dismantler of Costumes. And you can see now that he gets a completely new win condition called Ego Death. And the Ego Death is to deprogram Fear from the World Tree deck. Once per turn effect, cost 0, put 1 design element card you control in the discarnate zone. Intuit cards from the World Tree deck equal to the star cost of the design card. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there, and we're not going to talk about all that now. But the main point is that you can see that Gavin has become Galzu and has a whole set of a slew of new abilities. And once Gavin becomes Galzu, you can't go back to Gavin. Galzu is who you play as for the rest of the game. So you want to be careful as to when exactly you deprogram everything, right? You don't want to clear your encumbrance pool right away. You want to try and maintain it as much as you can. You want to try and the ideal scenario would be to finish your ego win condition to manifest the perfect design, and then in the same turn deprogram your 5th negative ideation card. Because again, if you ascend, if you deprogram the cards first, you lose access to this win condition. You can no longer satisfy the ego win condition, and that's kind of important because in a game of flesh and blood, in a game of Mythion, in a game of Mythion, there is what's called the point threshold, which is the minimum threshold that both players need to achieve, and in this case, it's 7, right? So if you both achieve 7, the game can be considered a victory for one or both players, right? So right now, I mean, you can already put the math together in your head. That means that one player needs to be able to have done their ego win condition and their ego death win condition. The threshold might change, just so everybody's aware. The threshold might be something that changes. It could go up, it could go down, it just depends. But as of now, it's 7. And, that's another thing I need to talk about. So the ego death is a win condition that's worth 3 points. So ego win condition worth 1 point, ego death worth 3, right? So that means that in a total, like the total possible amount of points that a player can achieve in Mythion is that both players can achieve in Mythion is 8, right? 3, if both players satisfy the ego death and the ego, they will have 6 for the ego deaths and 2 for the egos, right? But it can be pretty tricky to fulfill the ego before ascending to fulfill the ego death, right? If the threshold is not met, the game is lost by both players. The game is over, and you have to shuffle up and play again. But that's effectively how it works. Okay, so now with all of that out of the way, let's talk about a normal turn cycle in Mythion. So we'll put this guy off to the side so we know that he is not in our game. All right, so in a game of Mythion, each player starts the game by drawing 4 cards. And that looks like 6, but that's just because there are 2 instances of this. As a matter of fact, maybe we can just cut that off. Okay, so you start the game by drawing 4 cards. And in this circumstance, we have drawn Anguish, Heather Sims, Tranquility, Cheers, and Cheers. Now, normally, in a game of Mythion, on the first hand draw, you will draw cards until you have a handful of non-negative ideations. Because you can't start a game of Mythion with a negative ideation in hand. It's a little too difficult. That could change in the future, but I don't think so. So in any case, the only thing you need to know is you draw 4 cards. If there are any negative ideations in your hand, you put them aside and you draw again, and you keep doing this process until you have a hand of 4 not negative ideation cards, right? Then you take the deck, shuffle it, and the game begins. So we have Tranquility, Cheers. You may play this card on your opponent's turn. If you do, they draw cards equal to half the amount paid to play this card rounded down. If you play this on your turn into a 1. Okay. Heather Sims. Heather Sims enters the theater with 3 counters. At the beginning of your turn, remove 1 counter and gain 3 resources. When there are no counters on Heather Sims, place it in the discard zone. Download. Draw 3 cards. When you channel this card, intuit 1. Okay, so now there's a bunch of things that we can talk about here. Number 1 being, as you can see, this is a relatively normal card, except we have 2 symbols that might look very strange. However, they are relatively straightforward. So Heather Sims is a character that can go into the Gavin deck, as is marked by it being a Gavin card. It's a Gavin character effect. There is a triangle, sort of a detached triangle with a 2, and there is a sort of spirally snake, which is followed by the number 4. So 2. No. We'll start with the snake. So the snake, the 4, is how much this card costs to manifest, meaning play, right? So in this case, this card costs 4. So in a game, you say, I will manifest Heather Sims into the theater. I will manifest Heather Sims into the theater. How am I going to do that? Well, I have to pay the cost. She costs 4 to manifest. So I will look in my hand, and I see I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if I want to play Heather Sims, who costs 4, I need to pitch these 2 cards. Download and Tranquility. Because Tranquility produces 2 resources. Download produces 2 resources and costs 2 resources, right? So what I'm getting at is that every card, almost every card in Mythion has 2 functions. The first function, of course, is to pay for its cost and play it. And then you gain the effect, whatever the effect is, right? The other option is to pitch it, meaning to put it in a particular zone. Let's move this over to the side. These don't need to be here either. Let's just move these right out of the way and come back here. Bring her back to my hand. So every card in Mythion serves 2 functions, right? So Cheers pitches for 1, meaning you can put it here and get a dice and gain 1 resource, right? And now this 1 resource can be used to pay for anything. You can use it to pay for the effect that Gavin has once per turn 5, right? You can use it to, well, neither of these have costs, or they do have costs, but their costs are 0, right? But if they had a cost, if it said destroy this object and pay 1, search your subliminal for 1 design element and manifest it, right? And you could use this 1 resource to do that. And so, yes, in this circumstance, Heather Sims costs 2, or no, she costs 4 and she produces 2, right? So if I wanted to do that, I could play her and pitch these 2 cards. And these resources would go up to 4, but of course I manifested Heather, and so they go down to 0 because I have now used the resources. And then we gain the effects of Heather, right? So that is the typical play pattern of a turn. That is how a turn will play, is you have 4 cards in your hand. You use X number of cards for resources, and you use X number of cards for effects, right? At the end of your turn, you do 2 things. Number 1, you don't have to, but you may put your whatever remaining card, 1 card you have left over, into what's called present thoughts. And that's just kind of sort of just laying the 1 card in your hand down to be and that's just laying the card down somewhere in the vicinity of your identity, so that it's clear that this card is not, part of the game or anything. Just lay it on top of them. And what this card allows you to do is something we'll talk about in a moment. And then the second thing you do after you lay a card down in present thoughts is you flip these over and you put them on the bottom of your deck. And that's it. And then you draw back up to 4 because you draw at the end of your turn. Aha. Now we've run into a very interesting scenario, and I'm very glad that this happened because I did not plan for this. So we drew 2 negative ideations. Anguish and loneliness, right? And we also drew the monster and bodice. So because we drew anguish, that means we have a slight problem. Well, no, because we drew 2 negative ideations, we have a slight problem that I'm glad we have so that I can explain it. So when you draw a negative ideation, you don't manifest it. Negative ideations go directly into play the moment they're drawn, right? So in this circumstance, we drew 2. Now, we can't put 2 negative ideations into the game at the same time it's kind of a difficult part to explain, but essentially if you draw 2 negative ideations in the same turn, you only play one of them, right? So in this circumstance, we drew anguish and loneliness, but we drew anguish first, right? Because it goes from left to right. So we drew bodice, then we drew anguish, then we drew the monster, then we drew loneliness. So loneliness goes on the bottom, and anguish goes into the manifest area. Then we draw 2 cards. Okay, so now we don't have any negative ideations, so we're fine. If we had drawn a negative ideation there, it would have gone into the play area. So that's the problem. Because what effectively I'm trying to avoid is when there are circumstances that I had run into where I drew 2 negative ideations, played both of them, drew 2 cards to replace them, drew 2 negative ideations, played both of them, drew 2 cards, drew 1 negative ideation, played it, drew another card, drew another negative, and then suddenly all of my negative ideations were in the play area all at the same time, and it was literally impossible to continue play. Like, it was impossible. Because these command such attention. They're so dangerous to have in a game that you absolutely, under no circumstances can you allow them to stay, right? So the very, very clear cut way to think about it is, if at the end of your turn you draw more than 1 negative ideation card, you play the first one you drew and you put the other one on the bottom of your deck. Then you draw cards to replace the negative ideation cards. And if you draw any more negative ideation cards, you play one of them. And you keep doing this until you have a hand full of non-negative ideation cards. Does that make sense? I don't know why I just asked the video that. The whole hand has to be blue cards. And, okay, so in this circumstance, I forgot to fulfill this with 3 counters. So she has 3 theater counters on her. We'll grab another dice for our resources. So blue will be our resource dice, and black will be our... Oh, we're going to need another dice for... Yeah, there's quite a number of dice in a game of Mythion, because there's just a lot of numbers to track. Okay. So we have bodice, monster, search for meaning, and a mountainous memory. And a mountainous memory produces 4 resources, so that's great for us, right? All right, so normally this is when your opponent would play a game, or play their turn, right? So Nima would draw her 4 cards. I think these haven't been shuffled yet. It looks like they've been shuffled. She would draw her 4 cards. She would do her effects. It doesn't look like she has a lot to do. So she would probably end up utilizing some sort of... Yeah, so she would probably spend her first turn kind of setting up Yeah, Nimba's sort of a combo deck. Um, if they're if you could call it such a thing in a game of Mythian. But she would take her turn, and then once her turn was passed, it would come back to you. Now, the first thing you do, of course, is resolve all the counters. So I'm just making sure that I've got everything in order. Yeah, so luckily for us, we drew Anguish at the end of our turn, right? So there's a window in a game of Mythian where once you've announced the end of your turn, everything that your turn is considered over, right? And if you draw a negative ideation in that window, meaning after your turn is over and you've gone to draw step, and you draw a negative ideation, it goes into play, but it doesn't get a time counter on it, right? So this card doesn't, as of now, does not have a time counter because it was drawn after the phase in which you would put time counters on cards. So that means you get one full turn of not having that card available for available to you. Basically, essentially get one extra turn. That's the easiest way that I could put it. If you were to draw a negative ideation card from playing any number of these cards, let's say this said draw 4 cards or whatever, and one negative ideation was among those cards, it would go into play and it would receive at the end of your turn a counter, a time counter, because it was drawn during the main phase of your turn. This was drawn during the draw phase, which is after the turn has ended. But anyway, so we have these 4 cards, and we have Cheers in Present Thoughts. So now we can talk about what Present Thoughts does. So Present Thoughts is a zone in which you can use any leftover cards to produce more resources than they normally would. Not always, but effectively a card that is in Present Thoughts can be used for one turn, the turn after it is in Present Thoughts. So last turn we put it into Present Thoughts. Now we are playing the turn that comes after that. You can take this card, put it in the pitch zone, and gain 3 resources. If this card is not used, it goes to the discarnate zone at the it goes to the discarnate zone at the end of the game, or at the end of the turn, excuse me. But you can use it and should use it for as resources, right? Which is great because let's see, Heather Sims, at the beginning of your turn, remove 1 counter and gain 3 resources. So this goes down to 2, and this goes up to 6. We got 3 from Cheers, and we've got 3 from Heather Sims. So that means we have 6 resources to play around with. So we can choose either you or your opponent to look at the top 5 cards of their subliminal, manifest 1 negative ideation card from among them if it costs 2 less to deprogram. Sounds good. We also have this Bodice. This card counts as 1 of your 5 perfect designs. That's something we need to do in order to satisfy his ego condition. We have a Mountainous Memory. As an additional cost to play this card, place 1 card in your discarnate zone. A Mountainous Memory enters the theater with 2 counters on it. Whenever you draw a card, remove 1 counter from this card. When there are no counters on it, put it in the discarnate zone and draw 1 card and into it 1. So that's a card we don't really need to play right now. And then we have Search for Meaning. As an additional cost to play Search for Meaning, you must place a card in Present Thoughts into your discarnate zone. So this card is pretty hard to play. Search your library for 2 negative ideations and deprogram them. So it's very powerful, but it requires, let's see, could we have played that this turn? Let's see, this produces 4 resources. This produces 3 resources. And this costs 6 resources. So we could back this up, for example. I'm just going to do this because I'm the designer and I can. So this card I'm backing it up to the state in which this card hasn't been used for Present Thoughts. So what we're going to do instead, I want to make sure we have enough resources to do this. Yes. So instead, we are going to pitch a Mountainous Memory. gaining 4 resources. I think that's wrong though. I don't think it's supposed to be 4. I think it's supposed to be. I think this card is supposed to pitch for 3, not 4. These are not old cards. Like the art is relatively, all of that is relatively set in stone. I think I was tweaking some numbers at some point and I forgot to change this file. But anyway, so this produces, we'll just say it produces 4 resources for the sake of consistency. And because it doesn't really matter in this circumstance. But anyway, so we got 3 resources from Heather Sims and we got 4 resources from A Mountainous Memory being pitched for 4. 7. Now we're going to play Search for Meaning, which costs 6. So this will go down to 1. And we'll manifest Search for Meaning. As an additional cost, you must place a card in Present Thoughts into your discarded zone. So we're discarding Cheers from our Present Thoughts. And that will go into whatever zone is clear, right? And now we can search your subliminal, search your library for 2 negative ideations and deprogram them. That's funny. I forgot to change that to library. There's so many terms. So I think what's probably best is to search our subliminal for these 2. And the reason why is because they're the most expensive. They cost the most to deprogram, meaning the 7 is the highest number in Gavin's deck. So Anguish we've deprogrammed 2 Anguish and we have 1 Anguish left in the play area. So we manifest this, it goes to the discarnate zone. We take these 2 negative ideations and we deprogram them. And deprogramming means remove from the game. Put them in an area in which they will not end up back in play again. We'll put that on the side of the table. They are gone, right? And you can do this if you want. I don't think it's necessary, but we can now take a dice, and put it on Gavin. So Gavin has deprogrammed 2 negative ideations. That means he has 3 left in order to ascend, right? Now, with 1 remaining resource and 3 in hand, the question becomes, do we want to draw 2 cards and 2 cards? Because we need to play Bodice. And we want to be a little bit careful here because, we don't want to deprogram 3 negative ideations before we've already deprogrammed 2 and we need to still search for 5 more. For 4 more, for 4 more design elements. Oh, and the other thing I forgot was you're supposed to technically shuffle the deck after you do that, where you search through the subliminal. I'm pretty sure it says that. Okay, this is just a straight up old version of this card that I forgot to change out on the tabletop simulator. It's the exact same card. It's just missing some text like shuffle your subliminal and subliminal. So what we're going to do, actually, I think is, let's go ahead and destroy this design element. Gavin's sketchbook. You can put it to the side if you like, just because this card will never go into the deck, right? So you can put it to the side, but it goes to the discarnate zone when it's destroyed. So Gavin's sketchbook has been used, and we will go ahead and search our subliminal again for a design element card. And in this case, we'll grab fabric. So So fabric. This card counts as one of your 5 perfect designs. So we will manifest this, and then we'll spend our last card, the monster, to gain 3 resources, giving us 4. We're not going to use all 4, but 4 to manifest Bodice. So now we have Bodice and fabric manifested. And I think that's it. That clears our turn. There's nothing else for us to do. Now, as you can see, as I'm playing the game, that I am just doing things until I have nothing else to do, right? There's no action point. There's no there's no limit as to what you can do in a turn. There's no clicks, for example, in Netrunner. There's no action points in Flesh and Blood. There's no mana. I mean, there is mana, sort of, but there's no like hard-lined, very clearly defined. This is my mana pool, like Magic. There's no incremental increase in mana like Hearthstone. Nothing like that. It's the resource system is extremely similar to Flesh and Blood. It's almost identical, except we don't. In Flesh and Blood, it uses 1, 2, and 3, and those are the only pitch values in that game. Whereas in this game, there's multiple different pitch values, and they're weighted. The pitch values are weighted very differently. They're weighted on flavor, basically. They're weighted on, Anguish costs a lot to deprogram because Anguish is a very deep-seated emotion, right? It's much less than pain. Anguish is deeper, so it costs more, right? And that's sort of the way that we've thought about it. Heather pitches for 2 and costs 4, and the reason why is because it's very painful it's very painful for Gavin as a character to reach out to his sister for help. But her pitch value 2 doesn't produce a lot, right? So this pitch value is meant to represent a sort of push and pull that Gavin has with his sister, in which he wants to reach out to her for help, and he knows that he should, but it's so hard to, right? And so that's how our cost systems are evaluated, right? But anyway, so that's the end of that turn. So we again take these cards that we used for pitch and we put them on the bottom. Now, because the cards were put on the bottom of the deck and they have been used for pitch value, we now go to the counters. Anguish now has 1 time counter on it, which means we have 2 turns to deprogram it, right? Now, if we draw another negative ideation card, it's going to be a little bit scary, right? Because now that we've done that, we will draw 4 cards, and we drew a negative ideation. We only drew 1. So now this gets played, and we draw 1 card to replace it, and luckily we didn't draw a negative ideation. So this one does not get a counter again. Let's put these somewhere else so they're not so in the way. Put these over here. And did we draw anything else? Oh, we drew hem. Okay, cool. That's good. That's good. This is another design element. So I'm hoping that this is starting to make sense as to what a play pattern, what a turn cycle is like in Mythion. You are drawing cards, you are paying for cards using your other cards to pay for them, right? So you have to make some kind of interesting decisions in order to do so. And then that's really it. That's the core element of play in Mythion. And you do that until, well, I guess we can go to the point in which we flip, and then we can talk about some other things. Okay, so starting our turn, we have Anguish and we have Loneliness. We have Hem, Tranquility, and that's a very strong card. Heather and Download. So I'm thinking that what we're going to do is we're going to pitch Heather, gaining 2 resources, and then we are going to play Download. Oh, there's one thing I forgot. I forgot to remove a counter from Heather, giving us 3 resources, so now we have 5. So we're going to manifest Download, going down to 3, and then we're going to draw 3 cards. Okay, we drew a negative ideation. So that goes into play. And because this was drawn during main phase, it means that we do not draw to replace it. I hope that makes sense. During main phase, Do not draw to replace it. End phase, before you pass your turn, draw to replace it. So Paranoia was drawn. It goes into play. Neither of these cards have counters on them, so you have 2 turns to deprogram this one, and you have 2 turns to deprogram this one. Now we are in a lot of trouble, right? We have to pay 7 for this and 10 for these 2 combined, right? Luckily, we have Tranquility. So what we're going to do is, how best do we want to do this? This card is just so useless to us right now. It's very good again for your opponent, but not particularly good for us. Well, I think we're going to spend 2 resources to manifest Tranquility, right? To target our Anguish. So Anguish is going to get deprogrammed, removed from the game. Oh, why does that turn into a different card? It's very strange. Okay, so these are removed from the game. And once Tranquility's effect has resolved, you put it in the discarnate pile, right? And then now we just have Paranoia and Loneliness left over. And 1 resource still available. And I'm trying to figure out how exactly I want to do this. Oh, Cheers, you're a frustrating card, aren't you? I want to keep download. Well, actually, this is good. This is fine. So we're going to pitch this card to go up to 3 resources. However, and this is something else that I want to note. When a card is pitched, meaning used to produce resources, it's called channel. So when you channel download, you gain 2 resources. Also, there are certain effects that when you channel cards, you also get them. So, for example, when you channel this card, Intuit 1. Now, what does Intuit mean? We talked about it earlier. Intuit means to draw from the World Tree deck. Now we can talk about the World Tree deck. So before we can talk about the World Tree deck, though, we need to talk about a couple of other things. Mainly these 2 cards here. So Fear and 5th Dimensional Design. These cards don't go into the World Tree deck unless you're playing as Gavin. If somebody in your game is playing as Gavin, the first thing they do before a game even begins is they put these 2 cards into the World Tree deck. The World Tree deck is a 10 card, and it can be more, but the first version, the starter version, is 10 cards. So there are 10 cards in this deck, and we'll spread them out. Bookworm, Our Heart, Unity, Enceladus, and that's it. So just these 3 cards. There's Bookworm, Our Heart, and Unity. And these cards are extremely powerful. And sometimes, and especially in future iterations of this game, extremely detrimental. So these cards can only be drawn when they are intuited, right? So if a card states Intuit, you draw that draw the number of cards equal to the Intuit, right? However, when you play as Gavin, you put 5th Dimensional Design and Fear into this deck as well. And you shuffle it, right? So that's the World Tree deck out of the way. So now the World Tree, normally the World Tree is 10. However, we're playing with Gavin. Gavin shuffles 2 cards at the beginning of the game into the World Tree deck. I just didn't do it because I didn't want to explain how the World Tree deck worked before we got to that point, right? So we channeled download, meaning we get to intuit 1. So we're going to draw 1 card, and we drew Bookworm. When this card is intuited, draw 2 cards from your deck. Then discard a card from your hand. Put this card in the World Tree discarded zone. Okay, so when this is intuited, we draw 2 cards from our deck. We drew Paranoia. Then discard a card from your hand. Put this card in the World Tree discarded zone. Actually, yeah, okay. No, that is correct. When this card is drawn, place it immediately into the theater. At the beginning of each player's turn, each player may choose 1. Gain 1 resource, intuit 1. Okay, so this goes immediately into the theater. So this is going to be this is going to be a little tough. So Bookworm is not the best card we could have intuited. I would have vastly preferred to intuit a different card. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to say about the World Tree deck is that it's a shared deck, meaning both players may intuit. There's only one in a game, right? It's not that Gavin has a World Tree deck and AI Nima has a World Tree deck. It's that they both have one World Tree deck, right? They both share one. And so if all the cards get played out of the World Tree deck, then the World Tree is tapped. You know, everything has been used. Anyway, so all of that out of the way, we got our random encounter finished. We had 5 resources, correct? And we went down to 3. I hope. It's going to be a little bit difficult. Okay, so I think what we're going to do then is let's just assume that we had 3 because I don't want to go back and figure that out. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to sort of illustrate the distribution of counters. So one of the things you could do is you could put all of these resources on this card, right? And you could say I'm going to put 3 resources. Excuse me. I'm going to pay 3 resources to deprogram half of loneliness, right? And then I will also pitch Cheers to put 1 on Paranoia, right? So now Paranoia will cost 4 total, but because I put 1 resource on it, it now costs 3, right? Loneliness costs 6 total, but I put 3 on it, so it costs 3, right? And so there are a bunch of dice required to play this game, or just some way to track counters in general. But effectively, I hope that makes sense. It's just if you pay 3 resources to deprogram a card, it is permanent. It's not like you need to do it all in one turn. It's just you put a certain amount of resources in your deck toward paying the deprogram cost of cards. Now, this might look extremely dire, right? This probably looks like, oh my gosh, we are going to lose this game. Because like I said, if any of these go off, both players lose, right? However, there's a very key mechanic in Mythion, which is that your opponent can and should help you deprogram cards, right? So, in this particular case with loneliness, you can't. Your opponent may not help you clear this negative ideation, right? That should say deprogram. I must have not put in the most recent version of these cards. Like everything is the same. It's just I've gone in and I've fine-tuned all the language. Paranoia. This one is just generic, right? It doesn't state anything. It just says you and your opponent have X turns to remove this card from the game. With the clock symbol, basically defining what the clock symbol is. So your opponent can help you pay for these 2, which is good. That's a very good thing. I think actually we would be able to pay for this all on our own, especially if we were to put Hem in our present thoughts area. but we don't want to put him in our present thoughts area because we need to keep that card so that we can continue on our train of manifesting the perfect design elements. But yeah, so that's one way you can do it. Another way you could do it is, let's bring Cheers back to the hand. Is you could say, okay, I have 3 resources left. I'm going to put 2 on this card, and I'm going to put 1 on this card, right? Or any combination, 1 and 2, or you could do 1, 1, and then grab another dice and put another 1 on this, right? So you could do that because you have 3. So you could, any combination of deprogramming payments that you want to make, you can do. But I think it's best in this circumstance. It's probably better to put 3 on loneliness and then put Cheers into present thoughts rather than to pitch it for 1, because all of these cards are about to get time counters on them, right? It's amazing that it's only turn 2. A lot has happened in 2 turns. But yeah, so that is effectively a game. Now let's go ahead and just fast forward and assume, okay, all of these have been cleared, which brings us to the required 5. It actually brings us to 6, which is great. So when let me put all of these away. Okay. So when all of the when the required number of negative ideations have been met, right? 5. You take your identity and they ascend. They have nothing holding them back now. Galzu, Dismantler, Costumes. Ego, Death, Deprogram, Fear from the World Tree deck. All right, there we go. So that means that we need to find... Oops. Press the wrong button. That means we need to find this card and deprogram it. And it costs 9. And you have 2 turns to do it. At the beginning of the game, shuffle this card into the World Tree deck. If this card is intuited before Gavin ascends, shuffle it back into the World Tree deck and intuit 1. Right? So now we're going to put that on top. And I think we're just going to go ahead and leave it on top. So it's pretty great that we drew Dyad Sprays, because now we can draw 4 cards into our hand, right? And we've got 4 cards, and this is going to be very simple. This is going to be a very simple thing to do. But so we'll say, oh my gosh, I just hit my microphone. Whew, that was scary. Okay. So we'll go ahead and say, okay, we've got our hand of cards, and with our hand of cards, oh, you can't see. Yeah, there we go. With our hand of cards, we unfortunately, we just didn't finish, we didn't finish our ego condition, but that's just how it goes. I mean, we still could have. I just am skipping ahead 4 turns or so to get to this point to show what an ego death looks like. So at the beginning of our turn with our 4 cards, we're going to announce, okay, at the beginning of my turn, I will intuit 1. Intuiting 1 card. Oh, I intuited fear. It goes into the theater, right? We've confronted it. We've found fear. Now we have a number of ways we could do this, right? We could break alchemy to draw 2 cards for extra resources. We could intuit 2 cards from the World Tree deck, maybe, if we wanted to do that. If this was activated for its effect, place it in the discarded zone. Okay, and then now that we have fear, we can simply, doesn't matter, we could pitch the monster, play Tranquility, and it's deprogrammed. I mean, it's very good that we drew Tranquility. Normally you wouldn't have any of these left, because you use them on yours. But because I skipped turns, we had one we just had a spare tranquility lying around, and we used it to deprogram fear. So this has now been deprogrammed, meaning removed from the game. It is gone, and effectively the game is over. Gavin doesn't have much left, or Galzu doesn't have much left to do. He satisfied his ego win condition. So the really only thing that he can do at this point is help his opponent. He can help them ascend, or he can help them, finish their ego. Yeah, ascend. So he can help them deprogram cards, or he can help them try and achieve their ego death win condition, but not too much left for our pal Galzu here to do. I suppose he could keep playing. Well, no, never mind. I designed the game and I forgot that you can't do that anymore. Because we didn't finish it, he can no longer I mean, he can manifest them. It's just that he won't get anything for it because Gavin is gone. He can't gain that extra victory point. So now he really needs to focus on helping his opponent get to 7, right? Because, again, you need to reach at least 7 points. There is another thing too, and this is a card that actually hasn't made it into the World Tree deck just yet, but there is a card that goes into the World Tree deck that is worth 1 victory point. So if you intuit it, you automatically gain 1 victory point. So that's another way to reach 7. So you would do something like, if you were in really dire straits, you would try and find Cheers, which is usually used to pitch, and you would wait till your opponent's turn, and then you would pay as many resources as you possibly could into channeling this, into playing this card for your opponent, right? Oh no, that doesn't work. Never mind. It's not intuit. Yeah, so you would just intuit yourself. And you intuit any number of cards that you can pay for. So in this circumstance, we could pay 1, 5. So we could do 5 resources and intuit 5. So it's a pretty safe bet that you're gonna hit on on that victory point card. And that's sort of a emergency stopgap measure to solving the point problem. Like, because if both players ascend before either of them achieve their ego, then the game effectively is over, right? I mean, the only other way you could do it is to get the victory point card out of the World Tree deck. That's it. It's the only other way. So yeah, that's the that is effectively the emergency stopgap measure in order to still complete the game. And that's a big mess of cards that we got all out on the table there. So I think we can mostly call it a video. I might end up making another video on just kind of how to play each deck. It might help newer players to understand exactly how this works. But I hope that this was at least entertaining and that you might have learned a little bit about how to play a game of Mythion. These are all the negative ideations. Here's more negative ideations, and that should be 29, yes. Gavin is the only hero, as of now, the only identity that gets to start with 29 cards, because one of his cards, the 5th dimensional design, goes into the World Tree deck. So you can see that Gavin's ego win condition is actually quite difficult to achieve. It's actually much more difficult to achieve than, I would say, the World Tree win condition. But Gavin is all about helping people. That's his function. Because another thing, and this is just like a really key note that I want to address about Mythion, is that the play, or the victory, isn't so much the goal as the play is. So there's not really, this is not a competitive game. You won't see competitive events of Mythion because there's too much required of you and your opponent to help each other. And you'll see that as you start to play Mythion, that you can't do it all alone, and that's by design. You're supposed to be able to you're supposed to help each other play the game, and you're supposed to help each other win. And a lot of the time the game will end in a tie, because because you'll both ascend, or you'll both, let's say both of you achieve your ego, and then you deprogram all the cards in your library, or the required number of cards from your library, you ascend, and you both achieve your ego death, so you both get 8. It's a very standard play. It's a very standard game of Mythian. And it's a tie, as it were, right? But I don't want people to really think of Mythian as a game in which you are actively trying to win as hard as possible. A lot of the, most of the fun, I would say, comes from the act of just playing and spending time with loved ones as you count and draw and find combos, because there's a lot of different fun little combos you can do in the game, like drawing extra cards to produce more resources, to draw more cards to produce more resources, and oh, but I drew multiple negative ideation cards, I'm going to need your help to deprogram them, I'm going to need your help to do this and this, I'm going to crack this to, or I'm going to destroy Gavin's sketchbook to find one of my design elements, and then about it, there's just a lot of things to do mechanically. And I wanted that to be the case so that the game was still fun while you weren't necessarily always looking for how to defeat your opponent. Because in this game, you don't really have an opponent. You have a collaborator, as it were. And in the case of a game of 4, you have, I mean, that's a mess. That's a mess of people. There's a lot of baggage. There's a lot of encumbrances on that table when there's 4. But yeah, so maybe I'll end up doing a video on each of the decks. I mean, I think that pretty well covers how Gavin works, and maybe I should make another one on AI Nima pretty soon, and then move over and make one on York and make one on Mashik, because these decks are very, very fun. I love York. York is so much fun. He's really hard though. So final note before I end the video is you can buy the set on makeplayingcards.com, and it comes with all 4 decks plus the World Tree deck. It doesn't come with dice and a bowl or a table, but it comes with these 4 decks. Everything you would need to play outside of dice and a table. If you want to try the game for free, you can, or for the cost of printer, you can go to our website and download the print and play PDF that will get you the Gavin deck, the Gavin and the AI Nima deck. And I'm just kind of organizing the 2 decks. And they will come in a PDF. Oh, and the World Tree deck. It also comes with the World Tree deck. The starter one, because you need this to play, as you've seen from watching the video. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that you get these 3 decks together in a PDF, and then you can do whatever you want with that PDF because it's free. So for example, one of the things I did often was I would drive down to my local like office supply store, right? Like Staples, or I live in Germany, so it'd be a DM. So I would drive to DM or Staples, and I, with my thumb drive, and plug it into a computer and print off like pretty high quality versions of these cards, and then cut them out of the paper, and then stick them behind sleeves, right? So this is a Flesh and Blood card that I own called Null Rune Boots, and I have a black sleeve, and maybe I should just make myself big here. This might be better. Oop, maybe not that big. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so I have my card, my Flesh and Blood card, and I have a black sleeve. And I can take the card stick it in the sleeve, right? And now I have a card in a black sleeve. Now you can then take the print and play PDF, cut the Mythion card out of the PDF or out of the printed sheet and slip it over top a card like this. And you can obviously you can do it with any card. You can do it with Magic cards, you can do it with poker cards, you can do it with whatever. But that would be how I'd recommend doing the print and play, so that you still get the stiffness of cards, but you know, you're playing with Mythian cards. If you want just cards, then just make playing cards. And we're trying to sell it for as cheap as we can possibly do. But that's just how it costs money, right? And I think that's pretty much everything. That is pretty much everything I wanted to talk about. And I guess stay tuned for the next video. When I end up doing a video on AI Nima, which I don't know, maybe I should. The game is pretty complicated. I'm actually amazed that I was able to design. I designed this entire game by myself. Every single card. Yeah. Anyway, and there is one more thing that I want to talk about, just really fast. And this is to address something before anybody else addresses it. Yes, every card in the game, every single piece of art in the entire game is made by... my face is in the way. Is made by AI. It's made by Midjourney. Yes, I know. I understand that people have monstrous reservations about the concept of using AI-generated art. And I want you to know, I understand. I am a writer myself, and I don't like the idea of AI taking my job. I totally understand that, right? Doesn't matter. It already did. It's already over. But I don't like the idea. But before people boycott the game or say that the game doesn't deserve to be played as a result of it using AI, I want people to understand that I looked into every avenue I possibly could for art assets. And the reason why I fell on AI was twofold. One, I just don't have that much money. I have access to Midjourney through an old contact of mine, and so that it was effectively free for me to use it. Not only that, but Mythion the card game is based on a novel written by my father, right? And we talked about collaborating for a very long time on a project together, and this was what we ended up kind of collaborating on. Was he wrote most of the lore and invented most of the characters and all that stuff. And then I sort of reinterpreted the novel through a game because I've been wanting to do that for a really long time. It just so happens also that the novel that he wrote is completely centered on artificial intelligence. Like the entire world is artificial intelligence in this novel. Everything is generated by AI, right? When you read the book, which you can also buy or you can find a link to buy on our website. It's going to come out in a couple days, as of this recording. If you read the novel, you'll see that the entire novel is heavily influenced by AI, which got me thinking and got me unable to not think about what does an entire game look like if the art is generated by AI. I haven't seen it. This is the first one I've ever seen. But how would an AI create a card game, right? Now, the AI didn't really make any rules. I did use a trial inquiry with OpenAI to see. I just put in like invent a card mechanic, right, and just to see what it would come up with, and the results weren't particularly good. There was one that it did have an interesting idea about an anxiety mechanic in a card game. But yeah, so I just want to kind of get out ahead of that and say, I understand your frustrations with AI art and but the thing that I also want to say is that I think it's pretty clearly Mid-Journey art, right? Like when you look at it, when you look at any art asset in this game, it looks like Mid-Journey. I mean, you can see it. And I make absolutely no effort whatsoever to conceal that this art was made by anything other than Mid-Journey. I want it to be clear as day that Mid-Journey worked on this game, right? The art is Mid-Journey. It's not mine. I prompted it. That's it. Mid-Journey made the art. I did not hire any artists. If people want to interpret that as the game having lower quality, that's fine. But that's what we chose, and we didn't choose it to screw over artists, right? We didn't choose it to take money out of artists' pockets. The game just wouldn't exist if we didn't have Mid-Journey. It just wouldn't, right? It's either the game exists with Mid-Journey art or the game doesn't exist. And I wish it could be different. I wish I had the funds to pay multiple artists, but I think at least it's good at least that the Vorthos, I suppose, or that the world itself supports the idea of using artificial intelligence and AI and I mean AI and artificial intelligence mean the same thing, but at least the world supports the idea of and ties into the idea of using AI generated art, right? So yeah, that's the main thing I wanted to say. But anyway, so thank you for watching. I appreciate you watching this tutorial video on how to play Mythion the card game, and there will be more videos in the future as I just, as thoughts come to my mind about like, oh, I should probably make an AI Nima video. Oh, I should probably make a York Butler video, right? And yeah, so I will see you next time. Thank you for watching.